The Creature Files, presented by the Department of Mythical Wildlife, with your hosts, author Todd Calgi Gallicano, Christopher McClary at the Sightings desk, and resident skeptic Vic Afsahi. So sit back and listen as we report the latest news and up-to-date information about the mythical creatures living among us. The Creature Files. It might just save your life.
Hello and welcome to The Creature Files. This is the show that's all about mythical creatures, and that includes cryptids and creatures from folklore, whatever might be lurking in the woods or in the skies or in the water, which is the subject of our episode today. Now, I'm your host, Todd Calgi Gallicano, author of the Sam London Adventure Series from the files of the Department of Mythical Wildlife. And so if you've just stumbled onto the show and you don't know anything about the series, please go to our website at mythicalwildlife.com where you can learn more. And even though I can do this show alone, I don't. I've got co-hosts. So let me go ahead and say hello to them. I have Chris McClary at the Sightings desk and Vic Afsahi, our resident skeptic, who's not all that skeptical. Hey, guys.
Hey, good to see you.
How's it going?
It's going well. So now every book in the Sam London Adventure Series features a few of our national parks. And to honor that on the podcast, my background is always a national park. The one behind me today has not appeared in the books yet, but maybe it will in the future. Who knows? Either of you know what it might be?
Is that the island from the end of Moana?
No.
It's got to be Hawaii somewhere.
No. We're going with a water theme this week, obviously, as our creature feature is all about a sea monster. This is the Virgin Islands National Park. It's located about 40 miles east of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. It's 40% water and is well known for its coral reefs, scuba diving, snorkeling, miles of hiking through a tropical rainforest, and its beaches, which are considered some of the best in the world. Well, enough about that. Let's get to the Sightings desk with Chris McClary. Chris, what do you have for us today?
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, as a matter of fact, we have two Ohio men with, what I would call definitive Bigfoot footage. I mean, I have never seen, this is the footage that we've been waiting for. Like all these videos out there that are grainy and hard to see, and it's like far away. Not this time. We have sharp, high quality, I would almost call this high definition footage. We have, and there's a lot of it, like they are following this creature through the woods. It is passing by many different times, multiple times in different areas. They seem to be tracking it for a while. I don't think that was the best idea, but hey, they got the footage. What can I say? But this is definitely some of the most definitive footage I've seen. This is in Ohio. And it's over in the Salt Fork State Park. And, they're saying this could be the Ohio Grassman, which, as you know, is more or less another name or variation on Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti, etc., the Ohio Grassman. So slightly different, I think, size this creature has, but I'm telling you got to see this footage. It is really something.
And we'll put the footage on for people to see. It is pretty amazing in terms of the quality of it. It's very high quality. And yes, the Grassman is a little bit different than Bigfoot, actually. It's a pretty well-known cryptid. The first sighting goes back to 1978 in Minerva, Ohio, when a couple of kids and their grandparents spotted a hairy 300-pound creature ruffling through trash. So it's sort of a Bigfoot that dumpster dives. This family would go on to see the creature several times after that, and even believed that their German Shepherd had been killed by the creature. Now, if we go a little further back from 1978 to the 1700s, we find that the indigenous people of the area actually spoke about ape men, bipedal ape men, that they referred to as the wild ones of the woods. In fact, they used to leave out food for the creatures in an effort to keep peace. Now, they're described as being about 5 to 10 feet tall, but mostly in the 6 to 7 foot range. They have footprints that seem to have claws or pigeon toes. And some report that they growl or bark, but yet others say that they cry like a child, like a baby. Now, it has a very strong odor. the odor of rotting that lingers in the area for days. It has a snub nose, deep set eyes, and a pointy, a bulky head, no neck, and monstrous wide shoulders. Now, some say that the hair is smooth. Others say that it's shaggy. They also say that it has luminous red eyes or orange eyes in some cases. And it's reported to be very aggressive and very strong, according to eyewitnesses. So the Native Americans would say that the creatures had the capacity for peace should it be beneficial for them. So that could sort of indicate a higher intelligence. But for the most part, they're considered quite aggressive, and they should be avoided.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, this one really hits a little bit closer to home for me because it takes place in Ohio. I was born and raised in Ohio, and I know this lake and I know this area very well. This Salt Fork, and it's a beautiful state park. If you've never been there, I recommend going. It's incredible, and who knows, you might even come across this creature if you're lucky, right? I just want to tell you one other piece of this story. The gentleman went on record and he said, seeing this creature was scary, but what he said was really scary. He said, when I couldn't see it, it was even more terrifying. And I'm going to tell you why. When you watch this video, you are going to hear the calls of this creature in a distance, and it is going to give you the chills. It is the most terrifying thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, no, I agree. In fact, it's sort of reminiscent of that audio that we received of Bigfoot back in, I think it was episode 2 that we played it for the audience, and that was pretty terrifying as well. So let's go to Vic of Sahi. Vic, what do you have to say about the Grassman of Salt Fork State Park?
Yeah, I did take a look at the footage of what Chris is talking about, and Chris is right. This is the best footage that we've seen in terms of picture quality, but there's something a little off about this. The dramatization that the filmmakers have sort of put together makes me highly skeptical if this is real at all, because they're both scared and yet not scared enough. They were not scared enough to pursue this thing, but they were scared to actually get good footage that wasn't obscured by 1,000 branches and trees. So, color me a little disappointed on this. I'm hoping that somebody's brave enough to really put their life on the line and go grab this thing by tufts of hair.
Vic, you're not going to be happy until someone dies at the hands of one of these creatures, but yet still has the video so we can find it later on their body.
I am waiting for the found footage Bigfoot murders, yes.
So now it's time for the creature feature. And this week we are covering the Kraken. Now, the Kraken is a legendary sea monster from Scandinavian folklore. According to the stories, the Kraken lives off the coasts of Norway and Greenland and terrorizes nearby sailors. Over the course of centuries, the Kraken has become a part of many of the myths and tales told by sailors in the region. It is one of the largest cryptids known, and supposedly can swallow whole men and ships and whales and pretty much anything it wants to. Now, some believe the legend may have originated from sightings of giant squid, which grow to about 43 to 100 feet in length, including the tentacles. They live at great depths, but have been sighted at the surface and have reportedly attacked ships. One of the most famous examples of the Kraken in literature comes from Alfred Lloyd Tennyson in his poem aptly titled The Kraken, and it goes something like this. Below the thunders of the upper deep, far, far beneath in the abysmal sea, his ancient, dreamless, uninvaded sleep, the Kraken sleepeth, faintest sunlights flee. About his shadowy sides above him swell huge sponges of millennial growth and height, and far away into the sickly light, from many a wondrous grot and secret cell, unnumbered and enormous polypi, winnow with giant arms the slumbering green, there hath he lain for ages and will lie, battening upon huge sea worms in his sleep, until the latter fire shall heat the deep. Then once by man and angels to be seen, in roaring he shall rise, and on the surface die. It's so good. All right, so let's separate fact from fiction with an expert. We are thrilled to be joined by Dr. Vicki Szabo, Associate Professor of History at Western Carolina University. Dr. Szabo received her PhD in Medieval Studies from Cornell University. Her teaching fields include ancient Greece and Rome, late antiquity, medieval Europe, and environmental history. Her research interests center on the medieval North Atlantic, marine mammal exploitation, environmental history, and she is going to talk to us about all things Kraken. Thanks so much for joining us, Vicki.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about this.
Okay, great. Well, let me just jump right in then. When did you become interested in studying sea monsters?
So when I was back in graduate school, I was in an Anglo-Saxon archaeology class, and the research topic that I'd chosen was bone artifacts. And I'm studying away, and it's all pretty interesting, but then I find a whalebone artifact, and the topic of the paper completely changed, and I thought, oh my gosh, using whales in the Middle Ages, using the bones of whales, all of a sudden I started seeing whales everywhere in every source. And whalebone was the plastic of the Middle Ages. So they used it for just really high class objects and chess pieces and just daily household items. So you can't study whales, as I found pretty quickly, without studying sea monsters. And I study the Northern world, and there's no place in the Middle Ages that has more sea monsters than the Northern world. So I got to study Vikings and sea monsters, and it was pretty good topic in the end.
Oh, that sounds great. So, well, so what can you tell us? Sort of, I talked a little bit about the Kraken earlier, but what can you tell us about this creature?
So this is a really interesting topic. I study whale use more generally, and I went back through my notes and I was looking for the Kraken, and it really does go back much further than I'd remembered initially. There are some Greek and Roman descriptions that would fit the idea of a giant cephalopod or a giant polyp, and I can talk about those a little bit more if y'all want to hear that. But the best sources really go back to the 13th century. And they're North Atlantic sources, Norwegian and Swedish. And if you think about those lands, I'm an environmental historian, so I always start with the land and the water. These people knew the waters better than anybody else in the ancient world. They relied on the waters. So the people I study, the Vikings, could go out to sea and they could name about 24 different creatures. And one of those creatures that they named was called Hofgufa. And Hofgufa is this giant whale-like island creature that befuddles sailors. And there are tons of different stories that go by the name Hofgufa. But there was a 13th century Norwegian source called the Kingsmere. Everybody starts with the Kingsmere. And this source has a really long description of what we typically translate as the Kraken. And I can tell you a little bit more about that description, but basically it is, they always call them fish because they're not quite sure, but they have these different sort of Old Norse and Old Icelandic names. But the author of the Kingsmere says, nobody can really tell you much about it. You almost never see it. And it's almost always at the shore. They never strand. And there aren't that many of them, but they're just absolutely massive in size. So the author also says, we're really lucky that there are only 2 of them, because if there were more than 2 of them, they'd be all over the place. And then he describes all these terrifying behaviors. So that's the first source, and I'm happy to talk more about those behaviors. The second source really starts to put a little more flesh onto the skeleton of this story. It's a 16th century source, and it's a Swedish archbishop. And he is like me. He will not go in the water if you pay him. He hates going on the water, terrified of everything in the water. And he's an archbishop. He's a Catholic archbishop. So it's his job to sort of survey the world and see what God made and catalog everything God made. And for him, he talks about the Kraken in the way that you and I know it. He says, it's horrible. He said, it looks like an uprooted tree. And he said, each of the arms or branches of this uprooted tree. And what a great visual, right? Yes. When you think of the Kraken, that's what it sounds like. Yeah. And he said these huge branch-like appendages, but the best part of this description is, he said, it has this giant eye that glows red. And he said, it doesn't matter if you're on top of the water, if you're in the water, this thing just glows brightly, almost like a star. And he says, these are absolutely terrifying creatures. They will encounter ships, drown ships. And that's the legend we know.
Okay. Now, so in that description with that archbishop talking about that uprooted tree, we have seen that, some recently believe that the Kraken is what we now know as a giant squid.
Right.
So do you believe that in a sense that we've found the Kraken with those recent examples of the giant squid, or is the Kraken something more than that?
Gosh, I think it's so individual to each culture that studies it.
Mm-hmm.
I would bet that at some point, the Architeuthis, which lives at, 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet, Norse fishermen, Norwegian fishermen, medieval fishermen pull some of these things up and they fight like mad. The Romans said these things were really dangerous. You did not want to be in the water with a giant squid or an octopus, a giant octopus. These things were, they said, more dangerous than anything else in the sea. So I can only imagine that they encountered these creatures and the story sort of grew up around them. I kind of like to think that the oceans in the past were so thick with creatures. And these creatures were really different than what we see today.
Mm-hmm.
Whales were much larger and in much bigger pods. I think the way the oceans have changed over time, and this is getting a little off topic, but the fact that we've only explored 5 or 10%
Yeah.
of the ocean, we're still learning. Unbelievable looking critters are out there. So I think the giant squid matches. And I think animals in the past were much larger than they are today. I think that's the closest match, but I like to think that there's still more curious things out there that we don't know yet.
Yeah, well, I mean, we had that story that sort of popped up a few years ago about the Kraken being spotted on Google Earth. I don't know if you ever saw that image, but there was some speculation that they had caught an image of the Kraken. Did you get a chance to look at that at all?
I did look at it. I think I follow some other blogs that talked about that, and it seems to be identified with a pretty well-known sea stack or sea
Okay.
rock, like by GPS coordinates. That's a rock. That's a well-known nautical landmark. It just so happens today, as I was going through sort of maritime feeds, a giant squid washed up,
Oh,
and that
wow.
thing was about 650 pounds, and it was massive. And I think that's kind of a standard one. So I think that story on Google Earth, that story from Google Earth wasn't what we're thinking about, but I mean, there are giant things out there.
Well, growing up, and you mentioned Roman and Greek mythology, but growing up as a fan of Clash of the Titans, there's that famous moment where Poseidon announces, "Release the Kraken." And as a kid, I just assumed that the creature was from Greek mythology. So, what happened? Is there a Kraken in Greek mythology, or was that some dramatic license that the writers took?
That's dramatic license. I mean,
Mm.
there are creatures, and there's a great author named Pliny the Elder, who
Pliny
died.
the Elder, yes.
Yeah, who died in the eruption of Vesuvius. And he wrote this astounding natural history. And that gets used and reused and reused throughout time. And he does talk about a giant polyp or cephalopod or cuttlefish. And he said this thing was so massive and its tentacles were so massive, it couldn't fit between the Pillars of Hercules. It
Mhm.
never made it into the Mediterranean because it was just too big to fit. And he talked about giant octopus in the Mediterranean that were really aggressive to fishermen, would even creep up on land. So there are these stories that they had, but nothing that really matches the description of the Kraken.
Mhm.
There's mythology, Andromeda is attacked by a sea monster, saved by Perseus, I think. And so there are these stories of sea monsters. There's one great, and again, this is a little bit of an aside, but there's one great story or book that talks about how the ancient world saw monsters.
Mhm.
Um, it's by an author named Adrian Mayer, who's fantastic. And she said, there's so many fossils scattered around the Mediterranean that when they were found, they would put them back together into forms that match their mythologies. And dinosaur skulls look an awful lot like sea monster skulls to them. This is what I love about the ancient world, is their creativity in their minds. They observed everything in the natural world and they found explanations.
Mm-hmm.
And everything made sense to them. And their creativity was limitless. So I don't think the Kraken existed in Greek mythology, but boy, they sure had monsters.
Yeah, they did. Now, I often talk about the similarity of creatures in folklore from various cultures. It's sort of like Joseph Campbell and the Hero with a Thousand Faces, right? So the Hero with a Thousand Faces. In this case, we have the creature with a thousand names. So we find, a Bigfoot on nearly every continent. So I'm curious as to if there are examples of the same or similar mythical creatures like the Kraken around the world. So is the Kraken something that's pervasive in other cultures, but just maybe sports a different name?
Nothing exactly like the Kraken. There's so many sea monsters all over the place. I haven't studied Asian mythologies deeply, and I think that would be an obvious place, as a maritime culture to look. What I do know is that we see repeated descriptions of whale behaviors. Whales out on sea had these really aggressive looking behaviors. And I think a lot of those are miscast as monstrous, sea monster behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
The closest one that might be sort of a parallel that seems to have an original tradition is the Midgard serpent. Jormungandr in Old Norse mythology, this giant world encircling serpent. It has a lot of similarities, but it doesn't have those tentacle qualities that we see in the Kraken description.
Mm-hmm. You talked a little bit about Hafgusa, was it?
Yeah.
Now, where does where's the name the Kraken come from itself? That term.
Yeah, so the Kraken it seems to come from an Old Norse. It's got some sort of Germanic origin that means sort of monstrous or broken. I've seen some reference that Kraki or Kraka refers to a monstrous creature. So I know in German, etymologically, Kraka is somewhere similar to whale.
Okay.
But Hafgufa is this, we have, I think, like I said, about 24 names of whales and monstrous creatures in Old Norse and Old Icelandic. And there are a lot of monsters, very specific monsters that hunt out humans. Hafgufa which becomes the Kraken. It's translated later as Kraken. Hafgufa imitates an island. It will sort of hover beneath the surface of the water and rise up, and sailors will sort of anchor themselves to it. It's a trickster. It will also hover underneath the surface of the water with an open mouth and then spring up and trap fish, sort of creating this sort of still pool that attracts prey. But we see Hafgufa, it's a pretty standard idea for a sea monster. And it's gigantic, miles in circumference, just like the Kraken is meant to be.
We're going to go to my co-hosts who have some questions as well. Let's go to Chris McClary at the Sightings desk for a question.
So I had a question about the giant squid. When I was growing up, I was always fascinated by the concept of it, but I don't remember there being any, it was all theory until it seemed like only maybe a couple of decades ago when one washed ashore and they actually had a photo of it. It was like, for the first time, it was like no longer a theory. Is that sort of accurate to how this has kind of come about, the giant squid being kind of verified in culture? Or, it seemed like it was sort of conceptual only until maybe a couple of decades ago.
So actually it dates back much further than that, which surprised me as well. Linnaeus talked about it in, I think, the 17th century or the 18th century. And he talks about the Kraken, he sort of dismisses it, and he identifies it with a giant squid. By the 19th century, navies, crisscrossing the Atlantic especially, are encountering them.
Okay.
and documenting them. And they're, 20 some feet, maybe 30 feet.
Amazing.
But it's pretty early on. And I think this is when the Kraken idea as a squid solidifies and really separates from whale mythology.
Mm.
When we start getting into sort of early science and they start to make connections. I will say there's one other idea that I forgot to mention before. There's one biologist in Canada who thinks basking sharks in the 19th century start to get entangled in nets, ghost nets, free floating nets. And he says he thinks that's the origin of a lot of sea monster mythologies. So there are two interesting ideas. One is navies are crossing the seas more, but also as fishing is getting more and more and more prominent and fishing waste and debris is being left, these encounters, both mythic encounters, but actual encounters with giant squid are increasing. And as fishermen are going deeper and deeper, giant squid are 1,000, 2,000 feet usually. And they're everywhere. They're everywhere. They just usually stay at the depths, but if fishermen are dredging up more things, they're catching them. So it goes back much earlier in the 20th century, which surprised me too.
Well, you also mentioned, that we've only explored less than 5 or maybe if we're lucky, a little more percent of the ocean. I've always thought, and I wanted to, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a marine biologist, and my path didn't go that way, but I did eventually get get into scuba diving, and I love doing that. And it's so fascinating to be down there amongst, under the water. But I've always thought, here we are talking about aliens and other planets, and the ocean seems to be so full of aliens, and they're constantly coming up with new creatures and I follow all these accounts on Instagram, and I'm just amazed by the things that show up down there in these documentaries and stuff, these oceanographers and these people that study these depths. It's amazing.
Things look like they're straight out of Disney or, DC or Marvel or something. I mean, they don't look like they should be real.
Right.
And the thing that I love about what I do is my people are observing. They're really observing like scientists, but they don't have scientific language. So they're explaining oarfish, which are, 50 or 60 foot long, unfathomably serpentine looking critters, and frilled sharks and goblin sharks, and, narwhals become unicorns, and the range of things in the sea that we don't yet know. I agree. I mean, I kind of want Elon Musk to build something, but at the same time, I don't. I kind of want to leave it. Right. I kind of want to leave it where it is. But
exactly. Let's not disturb it.
Okay, Vic, do you have any questions for Vicki?
Yeah, I do. In fact, this is very interesting, and thank you for being with us, Vicki. This is really, really cool stuff.
My friends won't listen to this, so I'm happy to talk to
you. Do we know from ancient record or any descriptions from old about, like, do we have an idea of how big a Kraken would be?
The descriptions that they give, that 16th century archbishop, he gives descriptions in cubits, sort of 12 cubits, 8 to 10 cubits, and that's a measurement that changes over time.
Right.
But they're estimating, if we amplify those into modern measurement, they're talking 100, 200 feet.
Wow.
I will say this, blue whales grow, I think, 90 feet, maybe a little bit more. And looking at the bones of whales from the Middle Ages, they didn't stop growing. I mean, they were massive. So I think seeing 100-foot critter on the sea was possible and probable.
That's interesting. I'm always fascinated by fossil records and things like that. And, when you look at some of these fossils of, ancient bugs and animals, they always seem so much bigger. And one of the explanations has been it was a more oxygen rich environment back then, so that you can, and contributes to their growth. Do you think that the oceans, the way that they're sort of changing, and the acidity and the heat levels and things like that, could it support a giant squid like 3 or 4 times the size of what we've seen so far?
So what I know about whales is that in the 19th century, the largest animals were taken out of the gene pool entirely.
Mm,
So whales today almost certainly will never grow to the same, even if we emptied the seas of traffic and
yeah.
emptied the seas of pollutants, genetically, they're never going to grow to that size again. There are ebbs and flows with climate. So sometimes the water, the water table and the salinity
Hmm.
are more propitious, for the growth of species. I
Hmm.
will say, if you think back to sort of more pristine waters, they had limitless food sources,
Yeah.
absolutely limitless food sources. So temperature and salinity are always changing, but their food was insane.
Yeah. It's
They
probably
so
the biggest factor.
they could keep growing and keep growing. I will say one Roman historian, Pliny said, and I'm going to read this quick quotation. He says the most diverse species in the waters are whales and sea creatures. He says life in the water allows for much bigger development than on land.
Okay, so on a completely different topic, your biography says you are skilled in the art of trebuchet construction. I would love for you to tell our audience what that is and how you wound up interested in such an unusual hobby. And also, what is the biggest trebuchet you have ever made?
Well, so I'm a medieval historian. I teach all these amazing ancient medieval history classes. And you can't be a medieval historian without knowing how to build a trebuchet. So a trebuchet is like a catapult. It's a more specialized, more refined version of a catapult. And it has a sling instead of a bowl on its throwing arm. And it has an adjustable counterweight that is often, you can have it fixed, but you can add to it. And that also swings. So a trebuchet is a siege machine used in the Middle Ages and the Crusades and afterwards. And they are used to knock down walls. And they have a massive throwing distance compared to a catapult. Romans could build catapults. The medieval people built trebuchets.
Hmm.
It all began for me with a student who wanted extra credit and said, if I build a trebuchet, can I get extra credit in class? So not only did he build a trebuchet, everybody in the class built trebuchets.
Oh, that's
So
great.
every year when I teach medieval history, we have a trebuchet competition. My biggest trebuchet was 8 feet tall and it fell apart the first time we used it. It was horrible. So I understand the theory, but not the practice. But we do at Western Carolina, whenever we teach medieval history, we have this grand field day and it is a blast. And it's really cool. It's a great way to learn about medieval technology.
Yeah. And so
Oh,
for those of you watching that have never seen a trebuchet, you can go to YouTube and look. Mythbusters, they built a giant one, and they threw a flaming object of some kind. So you can check that out online. It's pretty fun.
If I can just one up that, at the Burning Man Festival, and I believe it's been more than 1 year in a row, they have the flaming piano trebuchet. And over the course of the week, they launched 7 upright pianos lit on fire for distance.
see what the Middle Ages have given to us?
Incredible.
We know how to adapt to plague. We have flaming trebuchet, yes. I mean, thank God for the Middle Ages.
Not dull. It wasn't dull, that's for sure.
Well, thanks again so much, Vicki, for joining us and sharing your knowledge about the Kraken with our audience. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was a great time.
All right, so that was Dr. Vicki Szabo on the Kraken. Do you guys have any last comments about the Kraken?
As being such a fan of Viking lore, that really sort of, brought a lot of stuff home for me. Boy, I loved hearing about that. That was great. All I can hope is that we get to have a sightings desk of the Kraken at some point.
Okay, Vic, what do you have to say about it?
It's very interesting. It wasn't until a few years ago that the giant squid was entering the realm and staying in the realm of mythology, but now we have proof and video proof that it actually still exists, and we're going to encounter it more. So maybe there's hope for the Kraken out there.
I want to thank you all for joining us for this episode of The Creature Files. We invite you to go to the website at mythicalwildlife.com and vote in our online poll. Is the Kraken a giant squid or something more? please let us know. You can also join us or follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/mythicalwildlife. And we're also on Instagram and on Twitter. You can email us at info@mythicalwildlife.com. And if you've had a sighting, please go to the website and report it. Maybe we'll have you on the show. And make sure you subscribe to the channel so you can get more episodes of the Creature Files. And until next time, always remember to heed your call to adventure.
The Creature Files. It might just save your life.